Welcome back into the Talmud teaching series. In this particular series, in this segment, we call it the questions and answer segment. This is the question and answer segment where we answer a lot of questions that come in. And today's question is an interesting question. We've dealt with this question before, but I want to deal with it differently this time around. And here's the question. The question is, are church bells biblical? Are church bells biblical? Now, this question comes from pastors in Eastern Europe. Now, Europe has a long, rich tradition for using church bells. And then later on, it came to the United States, which influenced the Western world. And it has a long, rich tradition in using church bells. So now, and then we received similar questions from pastors in Asia with regard to church bells. So here's the question. Are church bells biblical? Are they biblical? In order to respond to that question, we must understand what was the purpose of church bells. Now, we have to understand that because there's a lot of division. There's a lot of division within the denominations and within churches between the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then we get the Lutheran Church with all the other Protestant denominations. And then a lot of things are assumed about church bells. And so I want to address the issue in responding to this great question, which is, are church bells biblical? Now, we received 39 different types of questions surrounding this area of liturgy with regard to churches. And so, what I've done is to put them all into one major question, and that is this. When you ask the question, are church bells biblical, then we need to ask another underlying question. Here's the question. What is the origin and the purpose of church bells? That's the underlying question in order to respond, are church bells biblical? What is their purpose? And what is their origin? And so this is how I would like to approach in responding to this particular question. Now, the tradition of ringing church bells dates back to AD 400, the year 400 after the death of Jesus Christ. That's pretty much when church bells come into the picture with regard to churches. And this is when Paulinus of Nola first introduced church bells in association with a church. And then about 200 years later, more or less, around the year 604 AD, the Pope Sabinius officially sanctioned bells usage. And from that day forward, from 604, it became official for churches to use church bells. Now, by the early Middle Ages, when you get now to the period about somewhere around the Middle Early Ages, church bells have become common in Northern Europe, and that's because there was a tremendous influence from the Irish missionaries. And so this is where we get the origin. So I'm trying to put the picture and I'm trying to put a sequential order to this. And so now we have the year 400, and then we have the year 604 when church bells come in. Now we have the Eastern Orthodox Church has a very, very long and complex history of bell ringing. And then the custom is particularly even more sophisticated in the Russian Orthodox Church. And there in the Russian Orthodox Church, it has all kinds of levels of bells, all kinds of different tones, which communicate different messages to the populace at large. So it's a very long, complex, and sophisticated usage of bells. Now, so let's look at what is the primary purpose, or what was the primary purpose, and what should be the primary purpose. That's if you agree to use a church bell for ringing bells today. Well, the primary purpose of ringing church bells today is to signify the time of worshipers to gather for church service. That's the primary reason why they're used. And so we see this, like, for example, in many Anglican churches, in many Catholic churches, in many Lutheran churches, they also ring the bell tower 3 times a day. And so this became part of the tradition. And these are large denominational churches that we're using, and this had a tremendous impact on the landscape of churches. And so they would ring these bells 3 times a day, 6 in the morning, 6 a.m., at noon, 12 noon, and then at 6 p.m. And the reason they would do this, it was to summon all of the faithful church members to recite the Lord's Prayer. And you would hear this everywhere. and they would stop and they would recite the Lord's Prayer. Now, where does this tradition come from? How did this now get incorporated into the church bells? Well, the tradition is influenced, by the Jewish practice of praying 3 times a day. And so Roman Catholicism brings that over from Judaism, which then naturally the Anglican Church, the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church brings it over into their tradition. And so now we have this tradition. And now where did they get that from? Well, biblically, let's look at the book of Psalm. Open your Bibles in Psalm chapter 55 and go down with me and look at this. I'm in 54. Look. Psalm 55. Look at this with me in verse 17. It says, evening and morning and at noon. Evening and morning and at noon, I will complain and moan, and he will heal my voice. And he will hear my voice. This is where they draw this idea from. Okay? This is where it comes from, because this was a Jewish practice. Well, you remember Daniel, when he was prohibited from praying? Well, turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6, and let's go over to Daniel chapter 6. And let's go all the way down to verse 10. Then Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, and look at this. Now when Daniel learned that the document was signed, he entered his house, and in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and offering praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously. So now you get the idea where we draw this from, okay? Where the Anglican Church draws it from, where the Lutheran Church draws it from, where the Roman Catholic Church draws it from. Now today, and I've been in a lot of countries around the world. I've been to a lot of countries, and you will see a lot of other evangelical Protestant churches, also pursuing the same kind of practice. Now, the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church states the Lord's Prayer was to be prayed 3 times a day in the early church. However, the Bible makes no mention of this. This is what we will call an ecclesiastical teaching. Okay, an ecclesiastical teaching is very different from a biblical teaching. Okay? The question is, does it violate biblical principles? That's really one of the other underpinning questions here. Okay, now. So we know that the Bible has no mention of praying, of associating church bells with praying 3 times a day. We understand that. In fact, the Bible doesn't speak about anything about ringing church bells, whether we should or we should not. It's not one of those issues of moral impunity. It's not. Okay. It's just simply it's a choice. It's a freedom of choice here now. It would appear that the Catholic Church was trying to supplant. Now, we know from church history, that what was the Catholic Church trying to do? It was trying to supplant the Amidah, and the Amidah is the Jewish word for Jewish prayer. Okay, in the Hebrew tradition, and so we understand that they get this from what? They get this from Jewish tradition. Now, the Amidah, or the call to prayer, is what they would call the thrice daily. The thrice daily, or 3 times ringing of church bells, also resembles the Islamic tradition of the Adhan. The Adhan, and the Adhan in the Islamic tradition is a call to prayer, in which the faithful are called to pray from what they call the minaret. And you see these in movies, and you see these in pictures, and you'll see it in the news, where in Islam, in a lot of Islamic countries, you'll see this very tall, slender tower. And all the way up to the top, there's going to be one or two things. There'll be a man all the way up there making a call to prayer 3 times a day. That's called the Adhan. Or they'll have a speaker up there. They'll have a speaker up there, very loud speaker. And it's a call to prayer. And so you can see that the major world religions have been doing this for a very, very long time. Now, bells are also rung during most of what they would call the Catholic and the high church services. And they will also use a small handset, okay, of handbells, okay. And those handbells are called the Sanctus bells, okay. And it's rung shortly before the consecration of the bread and the wine, again when the elements are shown to the people, okay. And so they would do this in what you and I would call in the Protestant tradition the Lord's Supper. And there are churches that do that today, okay, that are not associated with the Roman Catholic Church. Again, is that wrong? Is that right? It's one of those issues of neutrality. It's just neutral. You could choose to, or you could choose not to. For example, in the Lord's Supper, the Bible does not give us an indication. It doesn't give us a command how many times to practice the Lord's Supper. Some churches do it once a year. Some churches do it twice a year. Some churches do it 4 times a year. Some churches do it every month. Some churches do it every 15 days. Some churches do it every Sunday. And that's fine. We have no command in the scriptures as to how many times and when to do so. Well, it's the same thing with church bells. Okay? Now, I want you to also note something about the Anglican churches, okay? They follow the Catholic traditions surrounding what we call the Eucharist, okay? And the High Anglican Church is very similar to Catholicism, but the Low Anglican Church, okay, is closer to Protestantism in several different ways. So now, the idea of the sounds of bells ringing has spiritual value, okay? And the idea of ringing the bells, okay, has spiritual value. Is thought to have that the idea is that they have spiritual value. Is thought to have originated with the pagan winter celebrations where bells were rung to drive out evil spirits. Now, here's where we begin to get some of the cultural precepts seeping inside of this. Now, some churches still refer to the so-called, what they would call the apotropaic, the atropaic power of bells in their descriptions of the Sanctus bells, okay? And in other words, it had this power to drive out evil spirits. Okay? And so this is part of the mystical tradition and myths that are associated with ringing of bells, but it doesn't have anything to do with the church. Now, the belief that the bells drive away demons is pure superstition. That's all it is. It's just pure superstition and should have no place in the church. Now, later on in the centuries, bells were rung on Christmas Eve. Now, that came much, much, much later on, okay? And it was to welcome Christmas with a joyful noise. And so now the ringing of the bells took on a different connotation here, okay? And for example, turn your Bibles to Psalm chapter 95, verse 1. Psalm chapter 95, verse 1. And here's where we get, where it says, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation." So you can see this was to usher in, okay, Christmas Eve, which would usher in the day of Christmas. Well, later we can see this in the book of Psalm chapter 98, verse 4. I'm just giving you the scriptural background that is used for the justification of this. Okay? In Psalm chapter 98, you can see this in verse 4. It says, "Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth, be cheerful and sing for joy and sing praises." And so the churches began to ring their bells, okay? To ring the bells. And of course, bells are sometimes used as musical instruments, okay, in their own right. We understand that. In fact, many church services feature the music of bell choirs, okay, and they'll have 100 members in the choir or 20 members in the choir. They'll have 5, and they're ringing the bells, and it's absolutely incredible, okay. So to conclude here, the Bible neither promotes nor forbids the ringing of church bells, okay? The tradition of ringing church bells, okay, at a certain time of day or during the certain rituals seems to be more like a Catholic tradition. It's infused with a little bit of superstition, but once again, we have no violation of scriptural precepts here. But for many Christians, the ringing of bells from a church tower is certainly a joyful noise. Why? Because it's reminding of them of God's presence in the world. And the music produced by the bell choirs has blessed so many people. This is a short response to 39 questions related to should we be ringing church bells? Are church bells biblical? When the question is, what is their origin and what was their purpose? I hope the response helps you a great deal.